Okay, let's get going. So, good afternoon. My name is Guy Battle. I'm the Chief Executive of Social Value Portal, and also I am the chair of the ESG committee, that's Environment, Social and Governance Committee for the BCO. We're kicking off today with our series, our Cop26 series, and effectively this is our journey towards net zero carbon. And this is formed, or this is going to be the first one of 4 or 5 lectures actually that we're doing. The following lectures that will come up after this one, we're going to be looking at net zero carbon in operation. We're going to be looking at the value of net zero carbon. We're going to look at embodied carbon, everything that revolves around achieving or looking to achieve net zero carbon and embodied carbon. And then finally, we're going to be looking at the challenge around existing buildings, which is not a small challenge. And all of those lectures, or 5 of these lectures, will culminate in a conference that we're going to be running at Cop26 in November. So I hope you enjoy the series, and I also hope that you get involved in the conference. And one last thing, and we will be pushing this over the next months, is we are looking for as many BCO members as possible to sign up to the Net Zero Pledge by the UK GBC and others, and we'll be circulating some information about how you can sign up to that pledge over the next few weeks. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our chair for our first seminar. Debbie Hobbs, over to you.
Thanks, Guy. Thanks very much, and welcome everybody. And I hope you're going to enjoy this first seminar of the series. I'm going to do a very brief intro because we've got some really good panelists today, and then we're going to have some questions at the end, so please pop your questions in the Q&A box. Just to begin with, I just wanted to introduce the subject really to say I don't think there's anybody I talk to today who doesn't understand that we've got a climate crisis, including the cab driver I was with this morning, which was quite interesting. And the cabbie said to me, but hang on a minute, isn't hydrogen the solution? And then he said, but all these batteries, you know, we've got an infinite amount of materials to build batteries, haven't we? Which I think is fascinating, because when I started in the industry sort of 35 years ago and started talking about climate change, everybody thought I was mad, and most people would argue it wasn't a problem. So I think today we've seen a bit of a tide turning. Certainly in my role, I'm currently the Sustainability Director at the construction company ISG. I've been client side twice and consultant side twice in my career in the industry, so I've seen it from a number of sides. And we are increasingly seeing most tenders now that come our way asking for net zero. And that I find fascinating, from having to say to people, you really should look at energy efficiency. Could you get down to science-based target kind of levels? We're now in a world where everybody's asking for net zero carbon. I think the issues we've got is, can we define it? Do we know what it is? Do we know the size of the problem? We're seeing obviously new buildings all asking to be designed to net zero, but do people actually appreciate it's about the operation of these buildings once they take them on? And are they really thinking about the existing building stock? We've done a small piece of research in ISG just to look at the current energy levels in the existing building stock. And on average around the UK, we're looking about 300 kilowatt hours a metre squared per year for commercial buildings. And if that's got to get down to 50 across all commercial buildings on average, do we know the size of the prize? So these are just some of the areas I think our panel are going to touch on today. Without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to our speakers. First of all, we've got Mel, who's going to talk about the definitions of net zero. Mel Allwood is from Arup. She's a sustainability consultant in Arup's Buildings Group in London. She focuses on the delivery and design interventions that optimise environmental performance of buildings. Her team has a great reputation for innovation and market-leading use of things such as BREEAM Lead and Neighbours. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to you, Mel.
Good afternoon, everybody, and really excited to be here today, and thank you for that intro. Next slide, please. I've been asked to speak today about definitions. Sorry, back one. There would be a case for saying here that I've drawn the short straw and that my fellow presenters get to talk about all the interesting parts, but I obviously disagree. Next slide, please. As Debbie says, it's been so exciting to see how profound and rapid, and to witness the change in expectations around zero carbon over the last 5 years, over the last 18 months, over the last 6 months. The simplicity and urgency of the zero target has given us all the same clear definition, and the world is moving towards it. Feeding again on what Debbie said, at the moment, 68% of the world's GDP is under the control of entities with zero carbon targets. So it's not surprising it's popping up in briefs and specifications. In particular, a couple of points that I'd like to highlight are acknowledgement of the significant contribution made by embodied carbon and by unregulated operational energy. It's not that these elements didn't exist previously, but they weren't part of the headline conversation. So why do we even need to talk about definitions? How is this even interesting? Next slide, please. To answer that question, we need to take a step back and remind ourselves what the value of definition is. We're typically using it because we know that the zero carbon challenge is hard, and that we have to radically transform the way that we do just about everything in order to get there. We need to change, and if we're going to justify change, we need to know where we started, what the options are, and whether they make a difference. So we create a definition of better on the slide. We work out a way to measure. We seek opportunities to improve, test against our baseline, and occasionally this prompts us to go back and think about our definition, rethink our definition, so that the destination we're heading for is actually better. Next. But in this diagram, the important bit is here. This is what we're trying to do. The purpose of our definition is to allow us to make something better happen, which we need to do urgently. Next slide, please. And I'd like to emphasise again how far and how fast we've moved in solving these problems of definition, even in the last year. These 3 key documents were published respectively in August 2020 for how to calculate embodied carbon, in November 2021 for the Neighbours Guide to Design for Performance, and the baby of the group, UK GBC's recent guidance on carbon offsetting. In comparison, Vitruvius's 10 books on architecture covered all the points it was done and done 21 years ago, pretty much. The speed at which these seminal documents are being issued presents a challenge for all of us in keeping up with the pace of change. Next slide, please. And doing something about it requires concerted actions from all sorts of stakeholders who don't all necessarily share a common agenda. They're not necessarily working to the same budget or cost plan. They might not even be alive at the same time. Let's look briefly at the life cycle of a building, for example. The screen in front of you shows basically where the carbon is. The big green lump on the left, the first blip, is the embodied carbon in building the building in the first place. We operate the building, and assuming that the grey line slopes downwards, reflecting the decarbonisation of not just the UK's grid, but global grids over time. At some point, that building will become tired, and we will invest carbon in perhaps a new facade, perhaps some new services, refreshing and making it more efficient than it was. It will again continue to emit carbon as it goes through its second and perhaps many life cycles. And at the end, we will expend yet more carbon in demolishing what was initially loved and has become tired. Every step of the way, we're emitting carbon. If we're going to get to our zero carbon target, we need to make all of those go away. In order to be able to do that over long time scales with different actors, we absolutely need some common language so that we're all working from the same place. Let's start picking that apart with some numbers. You will see some bigger values in the other presentations, but I'm going to content myself with the lower end of the number line. Next slide, please. If we're going to do sensible accounting, we need to agree some principles for measurements. And that means that every bit of carbon needs to be counted exactly once. To reiterate, every bit of carbon needs to be included in some calculation somewhere, but none of it should appear in more than one calculation. That means we've got to agree, at least theoretically, how to divvy up the impact of projects. So, first question, in our race to embrace zero, what are we including? When we measure against that baseline, what's the sum? There's a value in doing this initial thinking about this in three ways: geographical, chronological, and function. And anytime we do that calculation, we need to be crystal clear about how we've defined those system boundaries. Next slide, please. Let's take the geographical question first. What's the boundary of your project? What are you counting here? Looks quite simple with this project, but you'll see I've missed out the public realm in the drawing of the boundary of the project. Who is picking up that carbon? Does that belong to somebody else? How is that going to be accounted for? Really great way to answer this question is asking yourself, what is the locus of control here? And luckily in the built environment, when we work on projects, we typically have pre-packaged, pre-prepared definitions of this. It's the contractual boundary for the project. Where are you making a difference? That doesn't let you off the hook for anything adjacent. There may be fantastic opportunities to influence and find synergies, but defining the locus of control to map onto the contractual boundary is a very powerful tool to begin with. Next slide, please. And what about the chronological boundary? How much of the lifespan of the building do we need to be taking into account, being responsible for? This diagram will be increasingly familiar. It's taken from the RICS guidance on calculating embodied carbon and sets out the life cycle of the building in some clearly defined modules. You'll see I've drawn a green dotted line around some of the modules on the left, and these represent the embodied carbon that it takes to construct and hand over a building. We build buildings out of things. We either dig them out of the ground, or we grow them. We transport them somewhere to make them into stuff. We transport that stuff somewhere else to make it into a product. We transport that product to a building site, and we crane it into place. And all of those things, they emit carbon as a consequence of doing that moving, shaping, forming, heating, cooling, and installing. Typically, it's important for us to be able to understand how much of that carbon we're counting. And I would just highlight here that although all of the carbon throughout the lifespan of the building, all the way up to the demolition when we've finished using it, is important, the carbon within the green dotted line is carbon we're spending now. And when we recall the urgency of the question, in some ways that is the most important carbon, because if we don't solve the problem in the next 10 years, it's going to be difficult or impossible to solve the next 60. So really important for us to make sure that we are clear about how much we're counting and how much we're reporting, and we understand how we're going to reflect different incentives between saving carbon, both operationally and in embodied terms, over the life cycle of the building. Next slide, please. And now let's look briefly at a functional boundary, particularly critical, for example, when we talk about speculative office projects. Where does the boundary lie here? Again, to understand how to attribute carbon and how to incentivize investment in carbon reductions that will be accrued by entities later down the cascade, we have to be clear about where our boundaries are. How can we make it worthwhile, for example, with our speculative office projects, for developers to intervene in the base build to enable future tenants to deliver future carbon emissions? And critically, not just what can we do, but what can we not do to deliver carbon reductions? It's a huge challenge, particularly as humans. We're historically bad at spotting subtractive solutions, like maybe I just shouldn't install some things that accrue carbon because somebody else is going to rip them out and throw them away later. Next slide, please. Now let's look at this number again. We talk about net zero carbon a lot. What difference does it make to be precise with words? Here's some examples, ordered in increasing order of ambition. Next slide, please. At the bottom, low carbon, using best practice methods to reduce emissions. Next up, carbon neutral, no net increase in emissions with residual emissions balanced. Net zero, reducing emissions and balancing residue. And finally, at the top of the hierarchy, reducing carbon emissions to zero with no offsets, no balancing. Next slide, please. And let's be clear about what we mean by balancing. We're acknowledging that we have residual emissions and that they cause negative impacts. To get to zero, we should be following an emissions management hierarchy. We have to do everything we can to avoid the emissions in the first place, then to minimise those that we can't afford, and then and only then can we do good somewhere in order to offset the harm that we're doing on our site and arriving back at zero. Defining this and securing this good requires its own world of definition, but as a starting point, in order to be in the game, offsets need to address this list, seen on the left. It has to be genuinely extra. It must be permanent. You have to be able to work out how much good it does, and somebody reliable needs to be able to verify it. For a more detailed and very interesting read, I'd recommend a dive into the document on the right. It's another fresh document from last year, the Oxford Offsetting Principles. Really great deep dive into what it means to be able to stand up and deliver a viable offset. Next slide, please. And why am I mentioning offsets at all? It's because there's a limited amount of opportunity that we have left to offset residual emissions. There's not going to be a solution for everyone unless we can radically reduce both operational and embodied emissions to a level where we can meet those residual emissions with meaningful renewable generation and offset. Next slide, please. So coming back to the whole life cycle again, in order to get to net zero carbon, we need tools to make all of the grey go away. That's what it means to get us to zero. It's going to be really interesting and exciting, and being part of this kind of journey towards such a monumental and existential challenge is you know, these are great times to be alive. But it is going to need us to do something really differently, and in order to do that, we need to be delivering integrated solutions that reflect the whole life of the building, and to understand how we can use the synergies between aspects of the buildings to get us to efficiently and quickly to net zero. Next slide, please. Highlighting here that although we talk about carbon and there's no question that this is the most important of our targets, we must look at this in a context of social justice and environmental justice, and ensure that we think in the whole broader context of sustainability to ensure that our low carbon solutions deliver social value and reflects a long-term solution that addresses a wide range of the sustainable development goals and visions. We can't sacrifice social and environmental value in order to achieve net zero carbon. It's going to be hard, it's going to require a lot of adding up and taking away. But next slide, please. This is a quote from the technical leader of the 1968 mission to the moon, Werner von Braun. He's an actual rocket scientist, and I love this quote. He was asked why it took them nearly 10 years to get a man safely to the moon and safely back home again. Don't forget the second clause. And this was his response in reply to what was, I think, quite an impertinent question. Our two greatest problems are gravity and paperwork. We can lick gravity, and he said he'd solved that in 18 months, but sometimes the paperwork is overwhelming. So they could get it off the ground, but signing all the boxes to get it back to prove that they could get somebody back safely again took a little bit longer. That's about how long we've got. So I'll leave you with that quote. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mel. That was fascinating and a brilliant introduction to where we are. I think, you know, there were some great call outs there, particularly around defining these boundaries. You know, it's not clear in most scenarios, especially when we've got mixed use developments as well. And when you mentioned offsetting, it reminded me that the thing I find fascinating is even our largest corporate clients who have always said, it's okay, we're just going to offset because we own loads of wind farms in the US or whatever, are already now starting to say, we realise that offsets aren't the be all and end all. We do have to do the work first and make ourselves energy efficient. So with that fascinating beginning, I'm going to hand over to David. David Richards is a director at Atelier 10, and he describes himself as an unswerving commitment to net zero, and is an environmental engineer and also a design engineer, who I'm sure is going to take you through some fascinating discussions now about how we get to net zero. So over to you, David.
Thank you, Debbie. Hello, everyone. That doesn't mean I do swerve, so I might well do that in the next few minutes. And I also have a feeling, having listened to Mel, I have a feeling that we've all got the bad slot, and she had the good one. Anyway, I think much as Mel said, carbon has always been this rather nebulous thing that we have struggled to get our heads around. But it's now on an incredible journey. I think the last 2 years, and interestingly, particularly during lockdown, it's become the metric we're all talking about. And the question that Paul puts here about, it'd be much easier if it smelt bad. I don't think carbon suddenly smells bad, but I think the lack of carbon is starting to smell really good. And it's starting to make a real difference to a lot of people in the industry to have their projects meet the criteria. So the game changers, I think, probably have been a mixture of Greta and David Attenborough, who've really put climate change on the public agenda in a way that it really wasn't before. But I think for our industry, and the next slide, please, these are slightly different documents to the ones Mel showed. I think these 3 documents have really brought net zero to the forefront of our industry. So the REBA 2030 climate change targets, the UK GBC's net zero framework, and of course the LETI Climate Emergency Design Guide, all of which have actually given us all something to begin to hang our hats on. And I do deliberately say begin, because I think we've got a fair way to go before we're really certain about the numbers. But if we go to the next slide, this is a sort of translation, if you like, of the REBA targets, and they're pretty similar to UK GBC and LETI, and they show a trajectory, which is great because it means when we're commissioning, designing, and building buildings, we actually have something to aim at. I would say, though, I think in time we'll probably discover these numbers aren't quite right, and that's actually okay. It's Mel's little diagram there. We've sort of got to go through the loop of improvement, but the brilliant thing is we've got a start point, and we can now refine against these numbers to targets that we can all agree to, and that we can tie together across lots of different building typologies. Next slide. It also means that we can start to set out a roadmap for what we do in the process of making buildings. So this is particularly pertinent, I think, to operational carbon, where we can really drive the passive, active, and systems ideas much harder, because we know what we're aiming at. And I think already the numbers are starting to bite. I find myself having conversations as much about carbon as I did about cost, if you see what I mean. So already the numbers are beginning to bite, and I think are improving what we do. Next slide. I think there are a few sort of exciting things that this is beginning to bring out in the way we go about thinking about our buildings. One of them for me is, in the past, we've always tried to design buildings that have low energy demand and hence low operational carbon. But there's always been a slight ignorance definitely of how the building actually operates. But I think in particular, there's been a lack of a conversation between landlords and tenants to really work together to make a building that that delivers both on its landlord commitments and has tenants in it who are as bought into the low carbon ideas of the building as the landlord is. So I think there's this fantastic opportunity to have a collaborative dialogue between landlords and tenants, and actually make buildings that as a whole perform really well and are transparent with each other. So it's very clear where the energy flows are. I mean, to give you a rough idea, probably half the energy in most buildings is about the tenants and half of it is about the landlord. So it's got to be a team effort. Next slide. On the embodied side, you know, I mentioned the comparison with cost. We've now, I think we're beginning to have a process where we can put carbon budgets together for embodied carbon, and then measure ourselves against them in a very similar way, if you like, to the way we go about looking at cost in buildings. So assigning different budgets to different components of the building, and then holding each other to account about whether we hit those targets, or indeed whether we better them, or whether we need to you know, adjust the targets as we go through the process. Because, as I say, we are, I think, still in the sort of discovery moment. But I think the idea of having carbon as one of the budgeting metrics for projects is emerging now, and that's fantastic because it really holds us all to account. Next slide. That's not to say that it's all easy. So we're all relying on the holy grail of environmental performance declarations, EPDs. And for lots of the things we make buildings out of, there are EPDs, and some of them are pretty good. And probably in the structural world, we know a lot about the embodied carbon of different structural materials. But there are some parts of the building where we're really still learning. This is a piece of work we did recently, just looking at MEP for one of our projects. And the range of possibility is pretty big. There's a sort of variance of about 50% there between the lowest number and the highest number. So the industry and the supply chain here, I think, has quite a lot of work to do to get good, solid numbers that we can then feed into our embodied carbon accounting. So lots of work on all aspects of design, construction, and all the way through the supply chain that needs to be done. And I think that's a really exciting prospect for us as an industry. If we go to the next one, Mel sort of mentioned this in passing as she went through. Do we need to do all of these things? I think it's one of the questions that we're asking ourselves a lot. Do we need to do a base build fit out and then have a tenant come in and do some more fit out? If you just touch the button again, can we get rid of that piece? So can we go to a situation perhaps where the building just gets fitted out once? And that also points to different models of occupying offices. So do we head down the serviced model a little more easily this way, where landlords start to offer fully fitted out space or bespoke fitted out space for particular tenants, but they take on the responsibility of doing that in a controlled way with the rest of the construction process, so that again we can hit embodied carbon targets with a lot more certainty. Next slide. I think when all's said and done, we've now the hard bit starts, if you like. We've got a lot of we've got good targets. We've got an increasing amount of information about how to hit those targets, but actually to get there is going to take a lot of hard work. So the energy modeling side of things, the operational carbon that flows from there, that bit of it, I think we're pretty well versed in. We've been doing it for quite a few years. I think we need to work our numbers a lot harder than we may have done previously, and we need to get those numbers to flow into actual operation. On the embodied side, there's just a lot of accounting to do. We're all going to have to become accountants at some level, so that we track our carbon. We're going to have some quite big spreadsheets, and that's quite a long road for us to go through, but it is really where the action is. So we've now got to put our noses to the grindstone and get it done. If we go to the next slide, there are of course some things out there that I think will help on the operational side. You know, the application of sensor arrays and technology to actually track what a building is doing in real time, and adjust the way it performs in action. is a really exciting prospect. And I think we can expect in the next few years a lot of our buildings to become a lot smarter in the way they operate. On the embodied side, we're already seeing some really fantastic work automating the calculation of embodied carbon straight from a BIM model through to an embodied number. Early days, but I think that's probably one of the areas that we need to pursue as an industry, so that we can get numbers much more quickly, and we can use the power of a digital 3D model to do that. And finally, I think the thing I would just, sorry, next slide. The thing I'll finish on is, I think one of the interesting things about right now is we're uniquely in a moment where, as an industry, I think we're a little bit ahead of legislation. For years, we've been sort of running after changes in Part L and trying to work out how we can get as close to the line as possible. Now, suddenly, we have decided as an industry that we want to get ahead of legislation. So things like Neighbours, which has come out, is going to be a fantastic game-changing tool. And it's one that we've decided as an industry to put in place. It's not one that's been foisted on us. And I think that makes all of this a super exciting time for all of us. Thanks, Debbie.
Thanks, David. That's great. And again, fascinating. Some really good points that have come through there, particularly about the landlord and tenant relationships and the base build and then fit outs. As a construction company, there's a lot of office fit outs. It always scares me, the amount of stuff that gets put in and taken out again. And in a circular economy world, you know, we can't keep doing this. So surely we can find a way forward. So there's lots of things to consider, I'm sure. We've got a couple of questions come through, but please put more questions in the Q&A for our discussion afterwards. Otherwise, I'll take chair's privilege and then ask the questions that I'm interested in. So please add your questions in. I'm now going to pass over to Simon Alford. Simon is a founding director of the Architects AHMM. He leads a studio of 200 architects working around the world on design and construction of projects, and that reflect his belief that outstanding architecture must last through time and accommodate different uses to those that it might have been called for in the first place, which I think is quite an interesting concept given the very changing world we're living in. Simon is also a frequent teacher and judge on a number of awards. He's a visiting professor at the GSD Harvard, a trustee of the London School of Architecture and Chickenshead Theatres Trust, and he's also the president-elect of RIBA. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to you, Simon. Welcome.
Thank you, Debbie. Guy, I think he made a slight slip at the beginning when he said put your answers in the box. But I think in many senses, I think what Dave and Mel have said is we need everyone to put their answers in the box and share them with the rest of us. There is no definitive. There's a lot of measuring. I've worked with Mel and Dave separately and together over the years. And they bring a huge amount of expertise. And I don't disagree with anything they've said. I might disagree with the odd detail or how we achieve something. But what one could say for sure is things have changed very dramatically in the last 2 years, and indeed, I think as Mel said, the last 6 months. All our clients are thinking about net zero. So things like BREEAM, you know, whether you're talking about BREEAM Outstanding or 2018 or whatever it might be, they've sort of, they're just almost the backdrop to a project. What's much more important is a long-term analysis of it, which is absolutely correct, because of course, we finish projects, all of us, finish projects, but then buildings and people take over. Mel talked about actors, and I think in a sense, what life is a piece of theatre, and what we're going to remember is our clients are not just those who commission us. They're those who don't commission us but will occupy our buildings, and those who will occupy our buildings long into the future. And it's worth remembering, I think, that the most able clients are those who have a long-term interest in the buildings. So for instance, Dave said we're all accountants. An attitude to money and how you fund projects is important if you're going to release and allow the low carbon future. I think all of us construct ideas. I think we're at an interesting moment now where suddenly Embodied, that was important but low down the agenda, has flipped. So this is kind of Fuller's image of, you know, what would happen to Manhattan if you put a great dome over it, you would liberate it. And I think this is an interesting moment as the grid goes greener now, the embodied becomes ever more important. Does that change the way we think? Again, I think I know we're on a dynamic journey. So, you know, everything, there are definitive measures we need, but things that keep evolving. Next. So to me, it's this idea of the buildings we make are the backdrop for the theatre of everyday life. And what we should accept is those buildings will be adapted and used in different ways. Although I would slightly disagree with David's initial scenario that perhaps we got rid of, you know, some of the base building, put more in fit outs, because across the life of a building, there might be 10 fit outs, and that's an extraordinary amount of waste. So in the last 15 years, I've seen a move away from what I'd call white box office space to an idea that the office should be a kind of plug and play space that tenants should move into. And you will need less fit out if the space isn't delivered as a neutral white box that people then have to jazz up in the world of fit out. Next. The RBA 2030 challenge has been talked about. In the world of accounting and paperwork that Mel talked about, the simplicity of keeping it absolutely clear is incredibly important. There will be huge appendices to every project, but you've got to kind of make everything legible and apparent to you, to your client. You know, the design team have to learn to communicate very clearly. Next. I think this point about, you know, David referred to EPDs as the holy grail. I think the holy EPDs represent data. And I think it's really important and something, you know, that we need to get our heads on together. Whenever we work on a project, we talk about our data and that of the other consultants with whom we share. But actually, we need much bigger data that we can all draw upon. And it will require a shift in mindsets, because we're going to have to admit through post-occupancy evaluation where things have gone well and where they've gone badly. And no one likes that. But by admitting what goes badly, and there's a PI issue around this, you actually can learn. If everything is covered with a low carbon greenwash, then actually we don't learn, we don't move forward. Next. This is this idea, you know, this is data. This is this idea that we're going to, you know, even in the pandemic, you know, the journalists who live sad and lonely lives in the shed at the end of their garden kept writing that the office is dead. I'm absolutely convinced that the office is alive, and it's a very important place. It's a place where people escape from home, escape from their family, meet different people, share ideas, are tutored and mentored formally and informally. So it's a place of creative exchange, just like a city. It mirrors the city. So I always say the office is dead, long live the office. Next. In my career, when I was a young student, this was the sort of project people were doing, the autonomous house, Alex Pike in Cambridge. You know, early investigations were always around a sort of hippie community idea, but these were the pioneers who were talking about this old subject. And in many ways, we are relearning, you know, the lessons we got wrong in an air-conditioned world. Next. Patrick Bellew of Atelier 10, you know, 40 years ago used to lecture about termite hills. And I think there's a choice when we design offices. I think, you know, we work on smart buildings, we work on more basic buildings. I think there's a choice between what I call caves, which are termite hills, which are sort of passive devices, and oil rigs, the complexity of the computer and the BMS system driving everything, which can lead to a kind of Jacques Tati world of confusion. One isn't right and one isn't wrong. And every project is going to be a kind of a set of choices between oil rigs and caves. Next. You know, one of the statements is, you know, the greenest building is not a new building, it's recycling a building. We can recycle buildings. We should recycle buildings. I think that is generally and always has been the starting point for many of us. What is on the site? What can be used? However, that assumes that the buildings have been built to a reasonably generous standard, which again excludes a clutch of buildings built after the war, which were, you know, for reasons of rationing and other logics, sort of too mean to respond to change. So generosity is part of this conversation. And planning has an impact in this. The art of the architect over the last 20 years, working with the engineer, structure and services, has been to squeeze floors and get extra floors in. The reality is you need to lose floors and create long-term flexibility next. And of course, life matters. The actors that Mel talked about, a building with a low, net zero carbon that no one wants to be in is not a net zero carbon building. You've got to remember that buildings have to offer pleasure and delight for the inhabitants next. We were working on this years ago, and this is the Angel building, but there was a logic, a commercial logic to the Angel building that kind of was ahead of the carbon logic, which was about keeping a frame because it was generous and good, and the time and the cost we saved. So demonstrating that this isn't just an ecological idea, but this is a kind of complete building feasibility idea is very important next. At the White Collar Factory, with Derwent, having done projects like the Angel, Johnson and T, we built a working prototype. If you're going to spend a couple of $100 million on a building, and maybe more on the overall investment, you need to be sure, and you're going to be brave, you need to be sure. So I believe progress is made by iteration and learning across projects next. And this is this idea that Debbie was talking about, the endless waste. I've always been kind of frustrated at looking at, as we finish a building, half of it's thrown away. At the White Collar Factory, there's nothing to throw away. The rule we have based on Albertian slogan is nothing need be added, but nothing can be taken away. The structure is exposed. The finishes are imprints within the structure. The coal water pipes are cast into the slabs. The lights move, the reception desks move. So you can add to this in your fit out package, but you can't remove anything. There's an essential economy in that. We can't control the world, but we can set up better potentials next. And of course, that can then again run through this idea of pleasure. So that the BMU at White Collar runs around the roof, and when it's not in use, it's a running track. The loss of plant means we can put a club at the top of the building. So I think these kinds of things are important to think about. And indeed, as we move forward, maybe we will not be building basements. Maybe we'll be putting our plant above ground. There's a heavy take in procuring a basement. And on the left is the project we did in construction there for Gerald Kay at Helical, which was about saying there is a mean frame, but by putting double height volumes on it, we can use it. So this goes back to Mel's point that the challenge is what brings out innovation, not the desire to seek innovation, but the scale of the challenge, spatially or carbon-wise. Next. Our own occupation of the White Collar Factory is in a basement, but it was an existing basement. So again, this idea of even in a new building, you can reuse parts of what you found. Next. Our own rooftop is a BREEAM outstanding building placed on top of a building, a research project, external blinds, which no one uses, even in Holland where we work, although they're everywhere. So there's lots of things we don't use because someone has decided that it's not good practice, but we're going to need, as we move ahead, to challenge a lot of our assumptions, always challenge the assumptions. Next. Our own post-occupancy evaluation highlighted the difficulties of occupying a very thermally exposed, we're on the very top floor of a building, lightweight construction, because we had to be. So there's no guaranteed way of making a building of steel or concrete. The moment you say concrete won't happen, as people like Mace and others have come up with, almost net zero concrete. There are issues with CLT in terms of fire protection and insurance. But we've got to continuously share this. There isn't a way of building. We've got to develop ways of thinking and measuring and sharing, because I believe the suppliers and the market will continue to evolve. So don't think you've got it right. You've got, what you're looking for is the right principles of economy and elegance, but not specific materials. Things will keep changing. Next. And this is that, our initial survey after a year where we greatly improved the environmental performance, but luckily enough, we weren't going to sue ourselves. But the main conclusion we got to was to challenge design assumptions on other projects about comfort envelope servicing. So it's not just how can it perform, but how will people accept? What will people accept? 50 years ago, people wore different clothes in different seasons. Now we all expect buildings to be much more constant. We perhaps have to accept new gradients and new curves in the internal environment. Next. That's Jacques Tati's image of the kind of the elephant in the room of the last 18 months of COVID, a world of isolation. And this is what, this is why offices will survive and why they're incredibly important as creative and cultural clusters. You will get flexible working, but the office is a vital place to come. And therefore we have to make offices where you think about the journey. Mel was talking about where do we stop and measure? Well, actually, the good office is about how can you get to it. That's part of the carbon idea of the project. It may not be the measure, but it's part of the idea. From house to office and back. Next. So, it's a relationship between productivity, investment and energy. For the BCO to help drive this forward, we need models of how low carbon design has produced a better investment. Next. In our own office, it's crude measures, but correct. Absenteeism and staff turnover are a good measure of the performance. Next. This is the embodied carbon, as a little diagram on a project. Mel's ultimate one of a building that is net zero without offsets, I think is incredibly difficult where you take into account demolition. So I think we need to think about some of the rules as to how we measure this idea. So to me, any project is generating some kind of carbon. It's how do you offset it and what is constructive offsets. Next. This is a building we're doing for Merck, for Précy. It's an office building that's become a lab building for 4 floors with a collaborative floor and 6 floors above. It's starting to explore ideas of biophilic design. So this is an emotional as well as a physical analysis. It's also this idea of long life, loose fit, low energy. This idea about a building can be designed as a lab because that is the kind of holy grail of the moment, life sciences, but perhaps new uses will come forward. And how can that building adapt to those uses? And how can it be played with by others without being demolished? Next. So, we are measuring with our teams and our clients the performance at every stage. We're having to cross measure back. We're having to learn from other projects and we're having to share the data internally. Next. And as Dave said, the real problem to me is the 32 and the 35%. So embodied emissions to completion and the idea that we're going to actually use the same amount of energy in carbon over the life of the building in the embodied component seems absolutely absurd. Next. So we can get below 600 when we're designing a building now. We can measure it against what we're doing and perhaps we can keep improving that performance. But to get below 400 or down to 300 will be incredibly difficult. We can drive operational carbon down, but we need tenants to buy it. We need a different landlord-tenant relationship. Next. And that's the point, I think, now, when we're designing buildings of any import or scale, we should be assuming they are not removed and demolished, that they are generous enough to be endlessly adapted over time. I was told by John Forrester, now of Cushman Wakefield, then DTZ, but I was told that they couldn't demolish the Empire State because financially it was impossible to take that building down, put it up and pay for the revenue loss. So we should start thinking about what kind of building do we need to design that then will not be demolished. And that requires our clients and us to develop a long-term view. Next. The menu is very clear. There isn't a right way. This project has a big basement to store energy and supply it to others, but perhaps the next project will have no basement at all. Next. The challenge of operational carbon, and this is one of Dave's diagrams, is again, it's not one we can deal with because we leave our projects. We'll go back and measure them, but we leave. How do our tenants interface? And you need one bad tenant interface and a panicking agent to drive the kind of market back 6 months or a year. So we've got to share and educate each other. No one knows. We've got to share knowledge. Next. Bill Bordas said this: feedback is about feeding knowledge of outputs back into inputs. That's got to get new attitudes to contract, new attitudes to risk and liability. Next. And this is, construction and how we build. This is Laing O'Rourke and working on Soho Place for Derwent. How do we bring MMC in? There's still, despite the excellence of the contractor on this job, there's still incredible difficulties on site with waste and damage. Not because people aren't responsible or trying, they're working incredibly hard and are incredibly good at it, but it is still difficult. And we're still saying at the end of this job, we've got to sit down and learn, where did we fail, not boast about where we succeeded next. So that's the thing I talk about, a theatre, a stage set and a props. That's what we're designing. The theatre is the frame, the first thing to go up, the last thing to come down, and that you should never anticipate the demolition. That the stage sets the pieces that might last 15 or 20 years, and the props is an idea that the character of the space is so delightful that the tenant doesn't need to spend the same amount of money again fitting it out. The tenant can actually plug and play and exploit the spatial, physical volume and light and play of light and form and enjoy the space. Next.
Can we get
so to me, just
questions?
to end, I've just said, to me, this is the bridge. Cedric Price once said, it's not about designing bridges, it's about how best to get to the other side. And that's what we're talking about. How do we get there? There will be different bridges along the way. Some bridges will fall down, but let's share that knowledge and go on the journey. Thank you.
Brill, thanks, Simon. I didn't want to stop you because you were on a roll there, but we've got a couple of quite interesting questions come in. So I'm going to sort of pick somebody on the panel. They're totally off the cuff. The first one is about planning, really, and it came through while Mel was presenting. And it was really saying, what about to the left, really, of a diagram you had? What role do planners have to play in all this, especially the sort of dancing around, just sort of paraphrasing this, the dancing around that goes on during the planning phase. And I know personally, I've been involved in projects, where planners have said you can't have solar shading because it spoils the streetscape and all this kind of stuff. So first one to you then, Mel, what role do you think planners need to start playing in this getting to net zero?
It's such a great question. And the real importance of the question is that we do projects, project by project. And the role of the planner is to sit those projects in a context and make sure that each of those projects will contribute towards the aim that we're aiming for. Now, and a huge number of our local authorities have declared a climate emergency and have set up net zero as part of their target. The government has a target for net zero by 2050, and that's reflected in the National Planning Policy Framework. At a local level, I think there's still some work to be done to resolve the conflicts that inevitably occur between the fact that the council cannot possibly just have one aim of achieving net zero. They have a range of other outcomes to deliver, including preservation of our heritage. And it's a really interesting question about how we resolve those challenges, but the clearer and, as Simon said, simpler message that the planners can give us all as project teams, the easier it will be for us to all work to a level playing field and arrive at the right destination, using all the help that our planning teams can give us in making sure that we pick up synergies between projects. And again, we talk a lot about the need to change our relationship with tenants so that landlords and tenants are working on the same side. I think the really interesting next question is how we look backwards into planning and stop treating it as something that is sort of a consequence of our project, and start looking at it as a collaborative and creative process that can help all of us get to the right place.
Yeah, sure. That's a great answer. We've got only got 5 minutes left. We've got one more question, so I'm then going to ask this to David and then Simon. But it's a great question here from Chris Richmond. Thanks, Chris. All about tenants and how they get landlords to actually work with them. We've just procured or are procuring a new office in Cardiff, and we've had exactly the same problem of trying to get the landlord to understand that their leaky building is not got the value they think it has going forward. So the question is really about, as a major occupier of multi-tenanted buildings throughout the UK, they're very frustrated about the expertise of people running buildings. And I think this sort of begs the question, do we think the industry is ready to operate zero carbon buildings? And how do tenants work with landlords and their managing agents? How do they actually hold landlords and their managing agents accountable for running their part of multi-tenanted buildings? So Dave, if it's all right, I'm going to come to you first.
Yeah, thank you. I think that, I mean, it's a great question and very multifaceted. So, I mean, the basic question about how do you persuade landlords to be, I guess, to be more ambitious with you as a tenant? There's no easy to answer to that right now, I don't think. I mean, I think transparency is probably a key. So trying to persuade them to be transparent with you and with the other tenants about how a building operates, without sort of imposing limits or criteria on anybody. That's probably a start point. It's just have transparency of data. I think, I mean, of course, there is you can use your leasing arrangement to try and drive mutual performance in both directions. But there are only certain points in the process you can do that. I think probably in time, there is a, you know, once neighbours as an idea really bites, and we see a much more sort of open sharing of how different buildings are performing. I think landlords might be persuaded that it's in their interest to get their building to perform better, because it will keep its tenants and maintain good rental levels. I think that might be a bit of a stretch today, but I think that's probably a direction of travel we've got. And hey, who knows? It might come pretty fast given the journey we've been on in the last couple of years.
Yeah, you never know. You would hope so. And funnily enough, just to add the other side of the coin, I've been on a call with a lot of landlords who said, how do we get tenants to work with us to get net zero? So yeah. I've noticed Guy that's come back on. I think he wants to wrap up.
No, not at all.
Oh, okay.
15 minutes, Debbie.
Oh, okay. I thought we were wrapping up at 3 o'clock.
No, 3:15. 3:15. So
okay.
Time to get the conversation going.
That's good. We can carry on with a few more questions. So yeah, I think it's really fascinating how we you know, the landlord and tenants work together, and then also how is the industry ready for actually being able to operate buildings to net zero? So
that was, I mean, that's one of the other facets of the question, and I think there's you know, at the risk of offending a few people, I think that we need a step change in the capability of our FM partners in the industry, and so that their ability to run a building at its most efficient point, you know, that capability really needs to increase, and we need to do everything we can, you know, to help them get there. But I think that is one of the big missing parts at the moment, and I know it's one that a lot of operators of buildings are working on hard now. And I think a lot of the technology that we're starting to see come into our designs, giving transparency of data to all kinds of people, I think that will sort of encourage that shift. But I think FM and operation of buildings is one of the biggest areas of development for us.
Sure. And the question also notes that we've got the consultation out from BEIS on performance measurements of buildings using neighbours over 1,000 square metres. And if all buildings in the future start having a neighbours rating over 1,000 square metres, is there more legislation needed which then penalises either the landlord or the tenant, depending on which side of the coin you're on, going forward? So Simon, did you want to comment on this question at all?
I'll just go back, actually, because we've got more time apparently. I'll just go back on the planning one. So I think 15 years ago, it was a very unsophisticated world of a bit of external shading here or there. I think now, most planning departments, when the ethos of the project to be a net zero or low carbon project is developed and presented as an idea, not as a clip-on, will embrace that entirely. That goes to thinking about building envelopes, solar load, leakage, construction, embodied carbon, and the architectural impact of all these things is now embraced. In fact, you know, the city are challenges on the urban greening factor as well, which is a kind of, you know, much more of a local thing, but can have a huge impact on well-being. So I think we've moved into a much more sophisticated place in that conversation. But all of this low carbon design is never an excuse for the way something's turned out. It's an inspiration to make a better building, not a product of, oh, well, because of the embodied carbon challenge, it's actually the embodied carbon challenge, you know, and the need for light and air and, you know, and flexibility produce something wonderful and better, not something, you know, slightly compromised by the emerging market. And in terms of, you know, if a landlord isn't engaging with a tenant, there won't be a very successful landlord for very long. I would say over the last 15 years, landlord-tenant leases, lease duration, relationships, you know, our landlord talks about us as a customer of theirs. We have moved and formed different leases. We've moved around buildings, and they are a very, very large £5 billion REIT. You know, so the idea of a very distant relationship has changed dramatically over the last 5 or 10 years. And frankly, when we are building a building for a client who is going to, you know, let that building, there may not be a tenant at all until we've built it. Sometimes they're pre-let because they're so beautifully designed. But so, yeah, but that sets up the potential for the future. When, you know, most clients would now be concerned. I would say to a client, unless you build a building that's desirable to the next generation of occupiers, the employees of whom in the war for talent are obsessed about low carbon design and the climate crisis, and quite rightly so. Unless you build a building with genuine intelligent credentials, then you will be producing a worthless non-asset. The world is moving that dramatically, that's, I think, again, a very positive thing. And I think it will become more sophisticated. So your question about fines and punishment, I don't think the stick is the way to go. I think, you know, we used to have a joke, you know, doing Soho Place, one tree in the square that would die was going to give us more points than, for instance, planting 60 trees nearby somewhere else. So, you know, regulations are there. I mean, Dave once said to me, they're dragging us all forward, because he said, now we need to move beyond that. We need to say, that's a really good guidance. However, that bit of it is stupid. And therefore we've produced something better, and we've lost a point doing it. But then, you know, tenants is a much more sophisticated conversation, and you know, that's good. That's why it's exciting. That's why there's a real opportunity to make progress.
Great stuff. Mel, did you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I just really wanted to follow on Simon's point about FM and really ask questions about this level of transformation that we need to, you know, we need to envisage across the whole construction industry. And I think FM is a really good example of that. I think in the past, we thought of the kind of change we needed was to sort of buy different things, was to buy some solar panels or something. And now we really recognise that in order to make the fundamental change that we need to get to such an big ambitious target, it's not about buying different things, it's about buying things differently. And the FM question is, for me, is really part of that. If we incentivize our FM teams to deliver lowest cost solutions and pay them accordingly, then we'll get buildings that run at lowest cost. If we incentivize our FM teams to optimize performance, then we'll get the outcome that we need. And if that has an impact on the, you know, the level of skill and experience and heft that we need our FM teams to be able to input to a building in order to get them to run like we want them to, then, you know, that's part of the change that we need to make. They need to sort of step up to the plate, and we need to acknowledge the important part they play in delivering net zero carbon buildings in reality as well as in theory.
I think we do have to strike a balance of making buildings. We don't want to give everyone a Formula One car. No. We've got to strike a balance. You know, is it a De Chauffeur, a BMW, or a supercar? And we've got to strike this balance that people, not just FM teams, people interface with buildings. And you know, if you want to open a window, it's the wrong thing to do. It's psychologically tricky. So what we've got to, you know, we've got to there's a tremendous excitement about smart cities, smart motorways, you know, smart buildings. We've got to think which bit of the smart is smart, because not all of it will be.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that was a really good point, Mel, as well, which is about performance and how we contract in the industry. So one thing I think that stops us building buildings that perform at the moment is the way contractually we're all set up to deliver our bit and then leave very quickly. And so one of the questions is, you know, is it about actually changing the contractual relationships in the industry so that everybody's incentivized to produce a building that performs in operation? And now we have a lot more technology, you know, can we measure this sort of thing? So I've got 2 or 3 more questions coming through. So the next one is here about, is it about changing our language? Rather than assessing whether buildings have failed or succeeded to achieve targets, which has an adversarial outcome, should we all be talking about continuous improvement processes, which really is about that same thing? You know, how do we all work together better in the industry to improve performance? So just going around my circle, should I come back to you, Dave? What's your thoughts on how we get performance working?
Yeah, it's a great question, and you know, language is important. So I think absolutely. I think we have to have a start point. So we have to have a target that we think our buildings will achieve, but then the conversation should be about improving performance to hit the targets, and better still, improving performance to exceed the targets. So I totally agree. There's a lot of importance in the language we use with each other about how we get our buildings to perform.
I think that's really true. And I'm going to bring in the next question there before going to Simon, because it's sort of related. It's saying, is part of the change required from planners that they move away from carbon offset payments, which is almost like fines, you know, during design, but do they need a stricter obligation to actually deliver more efficient buildings? So this is about, you know, should buildings have an energy target set in planning? And I'll add to that, will the new Part L bring this in, and then will it be sufficient? And then what about embodied carbon targets in planning as well? Will that help us? So moving over to you, Simon.
Okay, I mean, I think it's an interesting one. It's the carrot and the stick. I like Dave's idea that we're ahead, and you know, the industry, you know, because you know, it's such a dynamic situation. The world has changed so dramatically in its outlook and its address, and the level of concern, if you take the US and Biden and his new announcement and a sea change there. If you know, there's always a way around something that's crude. I think we've got to change mindsets and not rely on, you know, regulation. I think when we present to planners, we are presenting an entire vision. Mel showed a crofter's cottage and talked about the public realm. It's no good me saying, wow, this is a fabulous low embodied carbon, super performing planning building that no one wants to look at, pass through or use. You know, this can't, you know, when I was a young student, I'll be very honest, the students who designed low carbon or low energy buildings were normally those who you wouldn't want to enter a building they'd designed. There was a very sad history of this. The world's become much more sophisticated with the best brains and the greatest talent properly applying itself. So what planners, like everyone else, like building control, should be encouraging best practice, but not actually saying, because what you'll suddenly find is you cannot use concrete. And then, you know, even though it's a net zero, it'll take a year to change that regulation. Or you're made to use CLT, even though it's an insurance issue, or whatever it might be. Or you've got these air changes that you must produce. And we'll start hemming ourselves in again. What we've got to do is say, we're making buildings that can respond. We should design an office building that can be turned into an apartment block and an educational building, and maybe have simultaneous floors in different use. We should be thinking these kinds of ways and saying to our long-term clients, you know, you're going to own this building for 60, 70 years. So there's no point just addressing today's market. You've got to address future, and that leads to ideas about generosity, adaptability. You know, if you look at the new idea about, you know, litres of air, are we going from 13 to 15? Do we over-engineer? The worst thing with the BCO is it makes everything over-engineered. Everyone has to get this particular lux level that no one wants, but the BCO said it because someone's asked for it, and then we're stuck with it. Then we have to. So we don't want that. What we want is evolving guidance on good practice. We want evolving critiques of that so that we're not suddenly trapped in a slow changing piece of regulation that doesn't recognize the dynamic world. That might require much more intelligent DASs and environmental statements as part of planning, but let's not transfer the challenge to someone else. We're all in this. And if innovations are going to come forward, the design team and the client need to present, you know, the fundamental underpinning ideas of their project that makes a delightful long-term piece of infrastructure for living in or working in.
Yeah, thanks. There's one more question which I'll try and squeeze in before we finish in a few minutes. And it's about short-term leases. And I love this concept of the building that you can add to, but you can't take away from, having seen so much waste in all this sort of fit out. And the question is, will short-term leases work for or against the aim of achieving net zero? Or will it be a neutral effect? So as the leasing market is moving to much shorter term leases, what effect do we think this might have on the market? Anybody want to go first? Simon wants to go first.
I'll give you a quick one. It's positive because it means the building owner, the landlord, is engaged much more often with their building. Yeah. If you build a building and let it on a 25-year lease, effectively, apart from a bit of management, you can walk away. If you've got a multi-use building being continuously churned in different and positive ways, then you are much more interested in the ongoing life of that building. So to me, culturally, it's much more positive.
Yeah, and I tend to agree with you there. I think if we're going to have a true circular economy approach to buildings, we're almost going to have somebody that owns the whole responsibility, for the life of the building. And Guy's back, so I think he might be. Do you want to do a wrap-up statement, Guy?
No, I'll let you do it. You've got 2 more minutes.
So really, it's just to say thank you to all the panelists. It was a great event. In the last 2 minutes, if there was one thing that you wanted to happen tomorrow to help us get to net zero quicker, in one sentence, what would it be? Anybody think of it first? David?
I'm gonna stick with the FM thing. I think if there was one thing with a magic wand that I could do, it would be to revolutionize the way we operate our buildings. And maybe that means some of the people who design and build buildings should go and be operators for a bit, and some of the operators should come and help us design.
That would be really interesting. That would be. But Mel, what would yours be?
I would concatenate the incentives for tenants and landlords so that they were both trying to achieve the same outcome, and working together was something they actively wanted to do because it benefited both of them.
That's a great one. And Simon?
I think I would remove the concept of fit out and talk about plug and play and occupation.
I like that. Well, with that note, thank you so much. It was a really interesting discussion. I sense we could have probably gone on for hours, but really fascinating. Thank you to those who put questions in. Sorry if we didn't get to anybody's. And I think it's time to wrap up. And Guy looks like he wants to say something.
I just wanted to thank you, Debbie, David, Mel, and Simon. I think, Mel, did you use the word concatenate?
Concatenate, she said.
Concatenate. I mean, I have to admit, I'm going to have to look that up. Concatenate. That's a great word. I realised in your explanation, it's great. And I thought it's fascinating the sort of the focus, David, on FM, which I think is. It strikes me as that we probably ought to make a link up with the Institute of Workplace and Facilities Managers, because they are such an important part. And I think just one other thing that I think Mel mentioned, which I rather liked, So it's not about buying different things, it's about buying things differently. And I like that very much indeed. Anyway, look, we've got another 4 of these coming up. The next one, which will be looking at the value of zero carbon, and that's being put together by Stephen Hill from Arups. It's on the 23rd of June, and it's going to be at 11 o'clock in the morning for an hour and a quarter. So if you fancy joining, watch out for the emails that BCO will send out. But in the meantime, thanks again, everybody, for the panel and everyone who has been listening. And we wish you a successful net zero carbon future. Thank you.